Hi, everybody. It's Paul Rabinowitz once again. Today, I am going to bring you a very special lecture discussion. I can't call it a discussion truly because we're not going to be hearing from you, unfortunately. However, today we're going to be going to Hollywood, California, and the concept of Hollywood is something that really has shaped all of us, whether we were born before World War II, whether we were born after World War II, as I was. Hollywood really began to elevate the consciousness of who we are as Americans, what it is that we want to go pay for, in other words, when we go to the movies, and what is it that we want to see. Hollywood was really divided for many years to be simply an entertainment vehicle. However, after the 1960s, Hollywood became a political vehicle as well. And we're going to discuss all that. We're going to talk about all that as well. And hopefully, what we'll get out of this lecture, and I really hope this will be the case, is that many of you, if you have access to some of these great movies, will begin to watch these films. These are critical films not only for the birth of our nation, meaning the birth of our Hollywood nation, or how America sees itself through great films like On the Waterfront, Streetcar Named Desire, but also how the world will see America. And I'm married to a South African. She's from Natal, which is the eastern part, that's the English side of South Africa. And she didn't grow up in the States, and she formed and shaped her vision of the United States really by watching films when she was younger. Now, the films that they saw in South Africa might have been the films that the government wanted to show them because South Africa during that time was under an apartheid government. But she came to the United States for the first time when she was about 26 years old. And she swore that New York only had taxis. There were no cars, there were no trucks. It was only these yellow cabs because every single movie she saw only had a yellow cabin. And so these are the perceptions that Hollywood gave to the world, but also quite controversial in many regards as well. When Marlon Brando, for example, refused to accept the Oscar, the Academy Award for The Godfather. So we're going to talk about all that. We're going to talk about the history of Hollywood as well. And without further ado, I'm going to go to our share screen. So give me just 1 second. And I'm going to go to Hollywood. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us a full screen. And I'm going to get my pointer. And we can start with the first sign. And of course, this is the iconic sign for Hollywood. Hollywood really was a nothing town, not even a village. It was basically a hotel, the Hotel Hollywood, in a small little area of Hollywood, California. So in other words, within the town itself, there was a very small little section that had a hotel, and it was a Hollywood hotel. But of course, that became the place where most of the folks from the East Coast, the great directors of the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, came to this place. It was wide open, and it was also a place where immigrants, Italian, Jewish immigrants, could go to Hollywood with little language behind them and still make a mark. And we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes, but I first want to show you this iconic photograph of Hollywood facing east, so facing away from the Hollywood Hills. It's a beautiful photograph with the iconic sign up above. You can go up to the place, let me get my pointer. You can go up to this area here and look out at this wonderful view down below. A couple of reservoirs, as we all know. Now, those reservoirs were made famous in the film Chinatown, Roman Polanski's film with Jack Nicholson. An incredible film. what we call film noir. Film noir meaning a new style of film that really evoked something that was unique to American viewers, and that was coming out of Italy and then France at that time. So here is Los Angeles. You can see the grand sweep of LA. This is where the early pioneers of Hollywood came to. You can see Hollywood, there we go. We can see Hollywood, the hills right over here. All of this area was sort of a small town living. Los Angeles was not really developed until way later, and it became more or less the area where our early directors would be able to find roots. And that was really important to them, to have this wide open space, not to have the confines of the East Coast with its urban environment, because they were going to do Westerns and they were going to do films like Ben-Hur, and they needed lots of space. So that brings me to the Hollywood Hotel, and why this place? Why not San Francisco? Why not another area? Well, it comes down to Thomas Edison. We spoke briefly one time when we were talking about the Academy Awards, on the eve of the Academy Awards. But we're going to go a little bit more into depth now about that. So as you all know, growing up in, or at least living in New Jersey and living in a town that is only 1 or 2 miles away from where this all started, which of course is West Orange, New Jersey. West Orange, New Jersey is the little town that Edison had his laboratory, and in that town of West Orange, he had the first film camera. And that first film camera was not this size, which is a cell phone, which can take wonderful videos today, but that film camera was the size of a large garage. And of course, the camera, which was the size of the garage, had a window slit, and as the sun moved or went over, or as the earth moved, I should say, the building moved with it, so it can capture the sun all the time. It needed the light. Now remember, this was before the days of huge spotlights. Edison had just invented the incandescent bulb, so we were going to really have to sit and wait a couple more years until Edison could bring that light bulb into a camera to formulate a artificial light. So what happened is with the camera being invented, Edison had a patent. And if Edison had a patent on the camera, it meant that anytime somebody wanted to use the camera, guess what? That's right. They had to pay Thomas Edison or Edison Industries, Edison Laboratories. And most of these people who were trying to break into the film industry, directors and producers, they didn't have the money. Or I shouldn't say producers, but the directors. They didn't have the money to afford themselves not only the rental fee for, let's say, studio space, but also to pay royalties. So for every dollar, I think it was going to be like 60 cents went to Edison. So that was a dilemma, because they didn't have a lot of money. The film industry was in its infant. It was just starting to walk. So they found a place out on the West Coast that was actually unfriendly to Thomas Edison and Thomas Edison's patents. The East Coast, who was probably starting to make some money now off of Edison Industries, they were not going to relinquish the fight in their courts over Edison's right for royalties. So what did they do? Well, San Francisco, I think it's the 9th Circuit Court, no, that's Washington, D.C. One of the circuit courts, which is based in San Francisco, was unfriendly to Thomas Edison. And they actually said, well, if you come out here and you open a studio out here, guess what? No royalties. So that was really the sweet spot that they needed to hear. So in droves, and many of them immigrants, as I said, a lot of Italians, a lot of Jews that were coming over from Eastern Europe, went west. And that is why today so many of those early studios were created by immigrants, because A, they didn't need the language. B, a lot of them were actors or vaudeville or script writers in their European countries. And so they went west, and it gave them sort of this opportunity to really start to spread their wings. And very quickly, they discovered this town called HollyWood, which allowed them two things. Number one, wonderful weather. So if they needed to film outside, they could, of course, and they took advantage of that. And the second thing is the open landscape. If they needed to film something in, a 2-mile by 2-mile radius, let's say an oncoming British army attacking the German army, or whatever it might have been, they had it. They had the space. So this is the roots right here, the beginning. HollyWood Hotel, 1884. You can see here Glen Holly. So Glen Holly became amalgamated and became HollyWood. Look at that. It's LA, folks. 1907, 1906, 1907. This was taken at the time of the San Francisco earthquake, a couple hundred miles north. But this was LA, and today LA is our second largest city and growing faster than any other city. So this is Edison. I'm going to switch it back to West Orange for just a minute. Put up here the patents. We already talked about that, so no need to go back over it. But you can see here that these studios were little 4x4s, so to speak. You could pay the actress. You had your setting. This is already where they didn't need to turn the building because Edison was able to figure out how to put the lighting to hit the tin to create the image, and then eventually the celluloid. And you can see here are costume designers. Either that's like a toy that will go into one of the scenes. This is the film cameraman in the early days. This is probably about 1910, 1915, something like that. And then as they started to make their way out west, you can see here the early days of Christie Film Company. That's a very, very early film company. Look at the size of it, right? And Nestor Comedies, Universal Films. Nestor will eventually become Keystone, I believe, Keystone and the Keystone Cops, Keystone Studios. So you have Christie and Nestor, right? Oh, Nestor Comedies, right? That becomes Keystone Films. Also, if you just go back one, look at these cars all lined up. These are the producers and the directors and the actors. Charlie Chaplin will step into this as one of the early heroes. And I would not be wrong to say that this actually might be Charlie right here. And the reason I say that is the actors were going to be kind of pushed aside in the early days, and this was going to be sort of more of the upper echelons. And this very much is out of place for what the time period would have been for some of those other, the money people, the producers and so forth. So for all we know, that could have been Charlie Chaplin. So as we talked about in moving away of the patent enforcements of the East Coast, especially the New York and the New York Southern District, which again today is in the headlines, but you can see here now HollyWood really begins to take off. Here, you didn't have to pay royalties to Edison. It was wide open. It was the Wild West, so to speak. You had lots of property, lots of land. This is the early days of the studios right here. These are indoor studios, of course. The on-site movies will be filmed a little bit later in the 1920s, but in the early days, in the 1910s, early 1920s, you have the opening of the studios right here. This is the early days of Paramount. The actors, filmmakers would live in the adjoining towns, Hollywood Hills and so forth. And then by the 1960s, Hollywood became such a massive industry, of course, that it became incorporated with a lot of the sound, music. Music became actually as big a moneymaker as some of the films. So if you consider some of these, early, not some of the early films, but some of the later films, the soundtrack to West Side Story, the soundtrack to Jesus Christ Superstar, the soundtrack to all of these films that were the Disney films later on. These were massive moneymakers. And so Capitol Records, of course, became, they collaborated with a lot of the Hollywood studios to create some of the great film scores, which are huge moneymakers, I should say. This is a photograph that I took recently. I took it from our hotel window. I don't remember the name of the hotel. We were only there for a night. We did a couple of things in the morning, and then we had dinner, my wife and I, and then we, in the evening, went to the great film studio, Grauman's Chinese Theater. And then the next day we sort of did some of the studios, but we saw it from the historical perspective rather than, you know, this is where they filmed Jaws. We were more interested in how these film studios started. So you can do a tour on that as well. I think you can see here, this is the Walk of Stars. Right there. Oh, and there's Disney. I didn't even see that one. There's Disney. Chinese Grauman Theater was one of the famous movie theaters, the early movie theaters. It was shaped to look like a pagoda, and then it became known as the Chinese Grauman Theater. Grauman was, I believe, Jewish, so you know, it's funny, this Chinese Jewish person who owned the theater. But this became a huge and important theater for the releases of some of these films, because remember, the distribution of the films, so the opening, the hoopla, hey, and then the distribution became the moneymaker. It wasn't the film itself, it was how were you going to distribute these films and who was going to buy these films. And if theaters would start buying them and they distributed across the sea into other countries, that's where you made these fortunes. This is how we saw it, my wife and I, when we went there. This is inside the Chinese Grauman Theater. It's a beautiful theater, done up in, as I say, sort of this Chinese elegance. Right outside the Walk of Fame. You can see here Ellen DeGeneres, Una Merkel. Is that Charlie Chaplin's wife, Una? Una Merkel? Yeah, I think it was Una. And then, of course, the Oscar or the Academy Awards. This is the Oscar, named after one of the early leaders of the awards ceremony or the Academy Awards industry, the Hollywood industries. This is the Oscar. Some of the other earlier film scores that I forgot to bring up when we were talking about the collaboration between the movie and sound industry, or music and film industry. Of course, there's all those great films of the 40s and the 50s, the musicals, Oklahoma, Guys and Dolls, and so on and so forth. So they were huge hits as far as the rights to the music. And that's still big today. This is the 31st annual awards. This is early 1950s, probably. You can tell by the cars also. 31st Pantages. Pantages is made famous as well. That's RKO. That's one of the movie theaters. And this is also was the place for the Academy Awards. You can see the red carpet. The cars would come in this way, right? And then these bellmen or doormen or valets, I don't know anymore, would open the doors, and then the movie stars would step out. It's such a huge thing. And what's fascinating about Hollywood, if we slow it down and take a step back, is if you write a book, you have to get that book on a bestsellers list. It's hard work. You have to have reviews written by it, and the reviews have to be written by trusted names in the industry. But Hollywood thought, why on earth would we have to wait? That's my air condition. I just turned it off. Why on earth would we have to wait for a movie to get good reviews? We can market ourselves. So why would a film studio, let's say like Paramount, right, have to wait for somebody to review their film. They'll just say, the new blockbuster film. But they were doing the marketing. You must see this as Godzilla. But they were doing the marketing. So they had it all lined up. They had the film, they had the distribution rights, and they had the marketing. It was almost like a no-fail business. And even if the film was bad, a lot of times, the initial opening would make so much money. But of course, one thing weighed heavy, and HollyWood, I'm going to turn this back on if you don't mind. HollyWood actually tried to capture this idea, and they were not successful at it. What HollyWood tried to do is they tried to get inside the mind of the American psyche what Americans would like. So rather than trying a new film and hoping that Americans would buy into it, they created an atmosphere of which they hoped would bring America in. So they created the chicken, and then the egg would come along. That's brilliant. Now, today, marketing is all about that, the brand, right? Everyone has to wear Nike. So if you don't wear Nike, you're not everyone. You know, if it's a new hair product, you know, this is going to make it. So everyone has to use that hair product. But HollyWood was doing the same thing. You have to see this because everyone's rushing to the movies. But by the 1950s, things were going to change because American psyche started to change. And the naive American who was building a character leading up to World War II, after World War II, we changed. And we wanted something more. And by late 1958, 59, or I should say even by mid-1950s, 55, 56, we started seeing films like Streetcar Named Desire. We started seeing actors like Marlon Brando, who we had never seen anything like that. We had never seen an actor in a t-shirt. The iconic actors were either in Western garb, cowboys, or they were gentlemen at the dinner tables. So we'll get to all that, but HollyWood didn't realize that by the 1950s, we were looking for more. And that was the beginning of what would eventually become the independent films. And today, the independent films really compete with Hollywood because they have turned out in the last 20 years some of the best films that this country has ever seen. Moonlight, for example. The great film that I love that film. It came out 3 years ago, won an Academy Award. It's an independent film made by a small company. No one even heard of the studio. This is the Academy Awards today. This was actually 2 years ago. You can see how much it's grown. I'm going to take you inside some of the studios, and then we're going to talk about some of the films. So this is 40 Acre Studio. 40 Acre Studio was one of the studios where a lot of the great films were made. It was an indoor studio, so all the things were set up to be filmed indoors. But they also had now this new outdoor studio, and that's why it was called 40 Acres. And although they also had the indoor studio, they could rent out their outdoor space, and they could build sets for anything you wanted. Now, if you have a keen eye, you might recognize what this was. This was Hogan's Heroes. And then they also used it for Stalag 13. So they built it once and they reused it because all that it had to be is a prison camp. And you can see the, right here, the guard station where Klink would spend his time. And then in Stalag 13, the actor that was inside there, he used the same one. So it was just repurposed. This gentleman, I don't know if you're, well, you probably wouldn't be familiar with him, but this is Mark Wanamaker. And he is a famous historian that takes you around these different places. I don't think he's still doing it. This was an older photograph. So these are the outdoor spaces. This is the Andy Griffith show. That's him right there, the wife, all the people. And you could see how large the cameras were, the lights, right? Look at these lights up in the front, massive. Even though this was outdoors, you still needed light, because if the cloud the sun went behind the cloud, it would darken the whole studio. So you couldn't have that. One of the most brilliant shows, I watch reruns because it's amazing how far ahead of the times they were. He just passed away, and it was amazing because the show was never supposed to happen. And of course, he took it to Hollywood. He was already a pretty big star before he conceived of it. And when he took it to the producers, they really needed to figure out, well, how is this even going to happen? Because if Norman Lear was going to make this a hit, he had to figure out if America was ready to have an ethnic son-in-law. He was Polish, black neighbor, a gay couple, anti-Semitism, to grapple with that, grapple with racism, misogyny, all of these things. And Norman Lear was saying, give me a chance. And this is, again, Hollywood was not sure if they wanted to. It was going to be filmed live. You can see here the audience, and that was going to be crazy, that they were going to have to actually get natural reactions to this. Well, the rest is history, folks. Norman Lear created an amazing show, one of many that he did create. And Rob Reiner, who was one of the actors, and of course, Carol O'Connor. Just a great cast of brilliant actors who were sort of character actors for these parts. And what All in the Family did is it opened up America. It opened up our eyes more so than what was happening in the streets. We brought it in. And after All in the Family, we could never go back. We created something that now America wanted more of. We wanted more of wanting to know how Hollywood would no longer dictate. Hollywood would reflect. A boom. This is how they were going to be able to film scenes looking down. Actually, it's great if you look closely. So this is, first of all, you can see the size of the scenes. These are literally like factories, warehouses. But here you can see this is the set of what was that? Fort Apache. Fort Apache. Fort Apache. Yeah. So this is all fake, right? This would be used for city scenes. This would be used for the Partridge Family as the great suburban neighborhood. This car would be used in other scenes. So this is what we call multiple purpose, where you drive down the street and you can have your urban landscape, your Revolutionary War log cabin, you know, or you could use the Partridge Family home over and over and over, and this would be your typical home. I believe this was also Andy Griffith with the porch. The beach and Gidget. And of course, what was so amazing is that this was not even a beach. This was a bunch of sand that they brought in to make it easy for the cameras and easy for the cameramen to do their thing. Here you can see Gidget down here, you know, and the beach party. And there was an amazing series of Gidget films made, all based on basically silly themes, silly plots, arcs that were all about boyfriends breaking up, getting back together. But this is where Hollywood wanted to create the narrative. Hollywood wanted to tell people, this is America. And of course, when Norman Lear brought All in the Family and ripped that stereotype to shreds, that America is racist, or at least some of us, America is anti-Semitic, at least some of, we could never go back again to Gidget. Hollywood tried, right? And even if you look at it with Hollywood 90210 or Beverly Hills 90210, which was sort of a granddaughter of the Gidget series, they were talking about racism, homosexuality, LGBTQ. So they were mental illness, but yet still set in the California Beverly Hills environment that Gidget was supposed to be coming out of. So we can never go back by 1966, 67. Television, Hollywood would never be the same. We're going to hold that discussion for part 2, where we really go deep into some of these films. I'm a photographer, and a lot of my photography is based on a lot of the early directors, not necessarily American directors. I like Ingmar Bergman, but how the films on the waterfront, Elia Kazan, would shape not only the American consciousness, but how we view art, how we view our heroes or anti-heroes. But we also had Green Acres, you know, a silly show about the Ava Gabor. I think Zsa Zsa Gabor was in it also, but Ava Gabor and you know, this wonderful European heiress from Hungary, and coming to live on Green Acres. And no, they didn't film New York scenes in New York. They filmed them here in Hollywood. And obviously all that they had to do was make one mistake with the camera and show the mountains. And you'd think, well, this is in New York, it must be somewhere else. So they couldn't do that. They had to make sure that the camera never went above that. And another famous show is Mary Tyler Moore. All of these actors had their own show. Everyone that you see here, Rhoda being one of them, Ed Asner, some great, Mary Tyler Moore, some just great actors. And again, the brainchild of Norman Lear, who put it together with a woman as the smart one in slacks. And as crazy as that sounded, or that sounds, it was unheard of. Could you imagine that? Can you imagine that today? Look at what the girls, what the women are wearing in movies or on television. And yet what Mary Tyler Moore was wearing as the lead actress in a show was slacks. And she was the one who really had it all. But of course, a woman still had to know her place in 1960s America or early 1970s. So she succumbed many times to the whims of Ed Asner, his character, who ran the studio. She had to basically shut up, but she didn't, so she figured out other ways to do it. So I'm going to show you one or two more, and then we're going to take a break. I'm going to come back next week, because next week we're really going to get into the films, the Academy Award-winning films. We're going to go deep into them. And it's going to start, we're going to start with the 1973, some call it a debacle, some call it a watershed of the year, that Hollywood now would become political, and it has never turned back since then. Matter of fact, Hollywood is the ire of Fox News. They berate Hollywood as being this political left-wing liberal machine every day, and how out of touch the directors and the actors and Hollywood is. So they've sort of branded Hollywood as the elites, which is actually what other countries would do when they were looking sort of for scapegoats, or, you know, it was the intellects in Russia, the artists in Germany. So, and now Fox News, of course, have simply branded all of Hollywood as the liberal elites who run the country, pull the strings, make the left or the young, the youth, make them think, which honestly was what Hollywood wanted to do, but of course they couldn't, because of course we all know that Americans are individuals. We all like different films, different movies. So that is what Hollywood is today. However, what we'll do is we'll come back next time and we'll pick it up with this, The Godfather. This is groundbreaking, and it'll take, I actually do whole lectures on just The Godfather, but we're not going to. We'll just spend a couple minutes, but we're going to set it up by this great actor, Marlon Brando, and how he got around to this, how he did it. This propelled him to be one of the greatest actors of all time. I actually think it happened way before that. We're going to talk about that as well, with On the Waterfront and Streetcar Named Desire. So with that, I do want to say thank you. Let me get off the share screen so I can see you all, or you guys can see me all. I want to thank you once again for joining me in our discussion about Hollywood. We'll be back next week where we'll continue with the Oscars and see really the meat and the potatoes of where this all went. So until then, stay safe. We'll see you again soon.